Hello! I'm LegenTerry, and this is Baldur's Gate 3, the long-awaited and extremely immersive RPG set within the Dungeons & Dragons universe. It was developed and published by Larian Studios. Now, before we start, I'll have to ask that you please ignore the awkward visual quality of my footage. I typically try to play on consoles when I'm able to because I haven't upgraded my PC in about 8 years, and it took me a while to find the settings that were low enough to run smoothly while recording that also didn't look like mud. If you see something that looks funny or off, just assume it's my woefully outdated machine and not the game itself. But anyways, onto the video. Baldur's Gate is a title that a lot of people will have intense nostalgia for. I am not one of those people. I've never played Baldur's Gate 1 or 2, even though I've owned a physical copy of the enhanced editions on Nintendo Switch for a few years. It was one of those things where I knew the legacy of the games, and I saw it at a store and bought it on impulse, fully intending to play it, but never finding the time. I'm glad I picked it up when I did though, because the price has since doubled. So good job, past me. On the other hand, I've had a pretty long-standing relationship with Dungeons & Dragons, having been in and out of campaigns pretty frequently, and even getting to be the dungeon master for a small group. My first taste of tabletop adventures began in high school with some friends of friends playing edition 3.5, but since I joined in super late, I didn't really understand the role-playing aspect or any of the mechanics. That session ended with me being pretty confused, but intrigued. You could say I was D&D curious. I came back to the table with another group at the onset of 5e, and I really enjoyed it. I've never been lucky enough to find myself in a single campaign that extended beyond a few months, but it's always fun when I get the chance to sit down and play. Enter Baldur's Gate 3. What once was originally a BioWare franchise has been passed down to Divinity Original Sin and Divinity 2 developers Larian Studios. Where the original Baldur's Gate games were based on the advanced 2nd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, also known as AD&D, this game is based on the rules established in the currently running 5th edition that most people will be familiar with. So where do I even start with a game this massive? Baldur's Gate 3 nails its presentation. Everything from the way the world of Faerun and the Forgotten Realms looks, to the detailed facial animations on every character, and the monsters brought to life straight from the pages of the manual itself are top-notch. The musical score from composer Borislav Slavov is really good too, and it definitely pulls inspiration from existing fantasy works like Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings score, while carving its own niche. I had Who Are You and Down by the River, a couple of gentle melodic songs with hauntingly elegant female vocals and strings stuck in my head all day after spending about an hour with the character creator. The voice acting is also incredible all the way through. I haven't met a single character yet whose performance I didn't enjoy. The one catch I'll throw in is that some of the line recordings themselves seem slightly off, like they were done in different studios or at different times from the rest. If I had to guess, a lot of this was handled during the pandemic, which means some actors had to work from home or find another solution. It's hard to nail down exactly what happened, but it's something that sticks out, and I can't imagine there being an easy fix, what with there being thousands of lines per character and multiple localized languages to keep track of. Oh well, I can live with it. The story has a surprisingly easy to follow premise. You're a person that was abducted by mind flayers and brought aboard their nautiloid ship. They stick a horrifying little tadpole in your eye socket that crawls to your brain, which is supposed to transform you into one of their own over a couple of days' time. A group of Githyanki soldiers riding red dragons assault the ship, leading you and a handful of the mind flayer's victims to crash land it and escape. With your captors now out of the picture, your group realizes that you don't share any of the symptoms with the ceramorphosis that was supposed to manifest. Now, you need to find a way to get the tadpoles out of your heads before you all turn into squid-faced aliens. When you start playing, you will have several choices to make, beginning with, well, nah. But then again... Anyways, after that you'll need to choose whether you want to make your own character or play as one of the many origin characters the game offers. These are characters with their own unique stories and interests whom you normally find during the campaign, and they each represent a different class. The developers, however, have said that the best experience comes from making your own character on a first playthrough and choosing one of these origins for a subsequent playthrough. So that's where I started. In traditional D&D fashion, I let the dice decide my fate. There are 12 classes and 11 races available, so I rolled a couple of d12s, with the 12 on the second dice meaning a reroll. Not all of the classes, subclasses, spells, or abilities are here because D&D is a constantly expanding game with new content rolling out all the time, and that would be nearly impossible. But there are way more options than you would expect if this is your first foray into D&D. What they have included is a very good sample of selections that represent the widest variety of playstyles. There's even multi-classing, which is where you blend together 2 or more classes as you level up in exchange for the ability score improvement or feat that you would normally receive. Rolling my dice landed me on a half-elf bard, which wouldn't have been my first choice, but I suppose that's what made it fun. I continue building out my character with a mix of dice rolling and decision making when necessary. The character creator is absolutely filled to the brim with options that will change not only your cosmetics, but also your gameplay experience. The world and the characters in it will react to who and what you choose to be based on the background lore of D&D. Each race and class come from different backgrounds with different histories, and everyone you meet will either be friendly, hostile, or indifferent upon first impression. There are tons of options to work with between body sizes, hairstyles and colors, horn shapes, scale patterns, and more. You can go pretty deep down the rabbit hole when crafting your own hero. Just remember, you'll be spending upwards of 100 hours with this character, so don't get too wild if you think you're going to regret it later. Though I have heard that Larian plans on patching the option in to adjust these looks down the road, so it might be okay. If you've ever played D&D, this plays almost exactly as you would expect it to. I'm not going to go over all the rules because we'd be here for a literal week, but trust me, most of the experience remains intact. Each thing that your characters do which rely on chance gets left up to the roll of a 20-sided dice. If you want to use deception to trick someone into dropping their guard, the game will ask you to roll for charisma and it adds any bonus modifiers from your skills and spells. If you want to try lockpicking a chest to pilfer the items inside, you'll use sleight of hand and roll with dexterity, and so on. This is the foundational rule that the game operates by, and it makes everything you do an exhilarating and terrifying game of chance. There have been a few tweaks to solve issues or get around the fact that there isn't an actual human dungeon master for you to bargain with. For example, in the tabletop setting, the cantrip spell Thaumaturgy lets you perform a minor magical act that's practically anything you can imagine as long as it doesn't do damage or affect the world too greatly. Rather than trying to emulate the millions of permutations that the single spell could entail, the developers opted to just make the spell give you a flat bonus to your performance and intimidation ability checks. Functionally, it's kinda doing the same thing it normally would be used for, just without the nuance of the roleplay. And if you don't succeed at every dice roll you try, it isn't the end of the world. This is a video game, and sometimes those failures might take you to interesting places where succeeding wouldn't have. It's very possible to fail upwards through a combination of poor decisions and bad rolls, and you might not end up in the place where you originally wanted to be, but you still have a fun story to tell. And if you really don't like how things turned out, you can always save scum. The only people who care don't matter. But you're not one of those people, you're cool, which means you're gonna like this video and subscribe, right? If you know anything at all about D&D besides that you use dice, you probably know that it relies on 3 core pillars of gameplay: exploration, social interaction, and combat. So how does BG3 tackle each of these? Exploration is pretty self-explanatory. The map's covered in a fog of war, and as your party progresses, more of it gets revealed. You can fast travel to magic sigils found in the overworld, which becomes extremely useful as the play space opens up to you. It's difficult to really express the size of the world to you in any meaningful way, so I'll just say I've been playing for over 35 hours, and I still haven't reached the city the game is named for. Like, I'm still in Act 1, and I'm probably still a dozen hours from reaching the second act. I'm just wandering the wilderness and settlements near the Nautiloid crash site, and still finding new places to visit. Each location you find can play host to traps, hidden areas, or high up places to scale. Just like in tabletop, you may want to get a better vantage point on your enemies, or even avoid a combat situation altogether. Players are given the opportunity to approach locations from multiple angles if they're diligent enough to find them, and can use maneuvers like jumping, climbing, teleporting, or flying to get there. The level design of all the battlefields that you fight on and the world itself is immaculate. There are objects to interact with and items all over the place for your characters to use and collect. In combat, you can shoot down hanging chandeliers, pull levers to open gateways, throw wooden barrels at your enemies. Pretty much anything noteworthy that you can see, there's probably something you can do with it. You can tell that extraneous amounts of work were put into making each area feel unique, and most of the time there's a cohesive narrative through line for why things are where they are. Nothing ever feels random or out of place. While you're exploring, the game operates in real time, but you can swap to turn-based whenever you feel like it with the press of a button. If you're trying to stealth your way around an encounter, your best bet is activating the turn-based mode while hiding so you don't have to react to enemy movements in real time. Enemy sight cones get highlighted and red on the ground while you're hiding, or by holding the shift key, which is very important when you want to remain unseen. One little thing I had a problem with as far as exploration goes was the lack of helpful traversal items. Any tabletop player can tell you just how useful a simple length of rope can be in any given situation. In Baldur's Gate 3, you can pick up the rope as an item, but it's just a junk item for you to sell. I know it sounds like a nitpick, but hear me out. There were a lot of occasions where I would have one of my high strength characters break off from the group and jump somewhere high up where no one else could reach for an item or a hidden chest. But the only way to get down is either A, jump back down and take fall damage, or B, have your characters down below stack up barrels and crates for you to eventually have an easier platform to land on. There's also a C option, having a magic wielder in the party with the Featherfall spell on hand, or a scroll that does the same, but it never feels good to waste resources like spell slots just to prevent a few points of damage. The way that Baldur's Gate 3 manages the second pillar of gameplay, social interaction, is the most impressive feat that this game pulls off. Every single character, no matter how small their part, has something to say. And not only that, but each one responds with an enormous set of variables at their disposal based on any given situation, which is all told through miniature cutscenes that have full motion capture and voiceover. The way that stories and quests intermingle and overlap with each other is insane. It really feels like a miracle that any of the system works as well as it does. Whenever you make a dialogue choice in conversation, it could easily cause ripples and ramifications in your version of the story without you even knowing it. You could interact with a character 5 hours into your journey, and they'll show up again 20 hours later in a completely different area with a cool quest just because you told them the right or the wrong thing. I cannot begin to imagine the spiderweb of dialogue choices that the scenario writers had to implement to make this happen. Any compliment I could give their team would not be high enough praise. All of that begins with strong writing of characters, and Baldur's Gate 3 has that in spades. Each recruitable party member has their own story to tell with their own baggage and some sort of problem or endearing quality that compels you to see their arc through to its end. Sometimes you'll have to stand between two of them on opposing sides and play referee, trying to reach some compromise that makes one or both of them satisfied. Sometimes you'll have to gain a character's trust before they break out of their shells and open up to you. And sometimes you'll simply have to put your foot down and tell a character that you think they're going down the wrong path. It always comes down to the choices you make and what role you want to fill in the narrative. And of course, on the other side of the coin of social interaction is romance. And whoo boy! Before the full launch of the game, Larian hosted panel events with developers to show off progress on the game and their plans for the future. And if you were lucky enough to see the final one, you witnessed something that can never be unwitnessed between a certain elvish vampire and an overly excitable druid that went viral soon after.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Some people in the gaming community have coined the term protagsexual, meaning that all of the side characters will be attracted to your own character, the protagonist of the story, no matter who they are. Anyone that's recruitable to your party is romanceable, which can lead you down some paths that are either nice and sweet or unhinged and hilarious, and everything in between. You aren't forced into nurturing relationships between your characters, you can keep everyone completely platonic if that's what you enjoy. But there's always a door open, if you want to get down and dirty. Outside of the main cast, you'll encounter loads of NPCs, all with their own personality types and personal agendas. The devs have done an excellent job creating these miniature vignette stories that happen in the background of the main story, which revolve around groups of these characters that you might never even encounter. There are massive, entirely optional quest lines that span tens of hours, and you could walk right past them being none the wiser. Part of the way through Act 1, you get tasked with assaulting a goblin camp to find a way to cure yourself of your worm problem. When you get there, you find out that this goblin camp is actually a fortress made from the ruins of an old grand cathedral. You could dive in headfirst and try fighting the endless waves of enemies, or you could pretend to be part of the fold and strike up conversations with them to get in. Once you make your way through the doors, you'll get smacked in the face with like 8 different things all taking place in the rooms around you. Some guys are arguing about the best torture methods to use on their victim, one group has another goblin caged up for worshipping an old god instead of their new one. In one of the back corners, a band of shady tradespeople gloat about the dozens of explosives they've been selling. There are so many ways to handle all these encounters, and if violence was your first choice, you would have only seen hints of the stories going on here. Finally, we can get into combat. I've already waxed poetic about the ways you can get into it, so let's talk about how you do it. Combat is going to feel overwhelming in the beginning, there is no real getting around that. Seeing the HUD light up with all the options is enough to give anyone choice paralysis. But if you take your time and learn what each command or spell does, and more importantly, organize them in a way that makes sense to your brain, it can be really exciting. If you aren't a fan of turn-based strategy-focused combat, then I don't know what to tell you. That's how the combat operates here. Though you can recruit a pretty large number of followers to your cause over time, your main party is limited to a size of 4 and the rest remain at camp, not counting pets, summons, etc. Each character gets put in a turn order dictated by your initiative roll with 1 action, 1 bonus action, and limited movement distance. The way your character fights will heavily depend on your class and subclass choices, but they typically fall into a few archetypes: melee, ranged, or healer/support. I really don't think I need to get into the obvious details about those. Some classes feel great in fights from the first level, and some take a while to build up steam, my bard being one of the latter. Their first level spell selection isn't amazing, but they eventually get more utility spells and a subclass choice that gives them more of a solid identity besides guy who carries around an instrument. It is a bit clunky controlling 4 characters at once in combat, as opposed to normally having 1 that you would have to learn to play. I would imagine this gets alleviated in multiplayer, as you can let your friends command any extra party members you have. But once you figure out the do's and don'ts for each class and wrap your head around all of their abilities, you can pull off some stupidly fun things. The common actions everyone has, jumping, dashing, hiding, disengaging, will add so many extra layers of depth to combat if you use them well. It's all too easy to forget that these options are there when you're just trying to pump out damage numbers or crowd control a group, but they're valuable tools that should be worked into everyone's kit. In particular, shoving being moved to a bonus action works wonders when you're fighting in elevated areas. A lot of combat comes down to positioning your team well. My advice, remember that you don't need to initiate combat with all of your characters at once. If you ungroup your party, you can move your ranged members to spots where they'll have the most cover and sightlines, or even prepare your team to ambush someone who's currently friendly. Proper planning can win fights as soon as they begin. This has quickly become one of my favorite games of all time, and I've been extremely positive. Does that make it the perfect video game? No, there are definitely some rough edges. The camera can be finicky, inventory management is in dire need of some cleanup, and there are visual bugs in a lot of the cutscenes. I've also heard that the final act of the game is lacking a lot of polish. No game will ever be perfect, but what Larian has created with Baldur's Gate 3 is a groundbreaking experience with hundreds of hours worth of content in a complete package with 0 microtransactions. I wish we didn't live in a world where selling an incomplete game is the norm, but that doesn't take away from any of the accomplishments that the team of Larian have achieved. Baldur's Gate 3 stands as a pinnacle among all RPGs, and the unmatched passion they have for their craft shines brightly in every aspect. You should absolutely pick up this game if you get the chance this year. You will not be disappointed.